Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Meet the Visionaries podcast, brought to you by the MIT Center for Real Estate. My name is Dean Feruzian, and I'm a current master's student in the Real Estate Development Program. This month, we have the pleasure of sitting down in person with Jill Brosig, Senior Managing Director and Chief Impact Officer at Harrison Street, a global investment management firm with a history built upon identifying, acquiring, and managing alternative real estate assets. Jill herself has a very unique background as a real estate professional, having spent her early career with organizations like Motorola, Argonne National Laboratory, and KMS Fusion, studying fusion technology and alternative energy experimentation. We are thrilled to have you here today with us, Jill.
Thank you so much, Dean. It's great to be here.
So first and foremost, being that we are here in Kendall Square at MIT, it only makes sense for us to open up this conversation with what led to the transition from physics and engineering and applied sciences to real estate.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how interesting of a story this is, or it's just happenstance, but I had been working at Motorola, and Motorola was, let's say all the rats were leaving the ship at that point in time, and I was trying to decide what I wanted to do next career-wise. So I went out and I reached out to a number of different people just to get a career advice. Chris Galvin is one of the founders of Harrison Street. He was the former CEO of Motorola, and so I had reached out to him. And he wanted to bring me on board because of all the things that his family is the one that had started Motorola. It was his grandfather.
Okay.
All of the culture that had been there. Motorola had invented Six Sigma. Motorola was doing a lot of things as it relates to how do you build leaders. It was just this wonderful culture that he felt Harrison Street was a wonderful point in their time. There was, my goodness, maybe 15 people in the organization at that time. And so he wanted me to come in and start the culture. And so he gave me the title Director of Business Operations Enhancement. A mouthful. And I would say probably every title that I've had is kind of made up.
Yeah.
But really how I got there was he wanted to instill everything that they had done at Motorola into his new company and really head up the culture, head up just where they were going. And that was back in 2005. And here I am, 2024, still with the company.
Wow. Yeah. So I'm sure quite a few things have changed in all that time. And
Absolutely.
I'm sure quite a few of your titles have changed in that process as well. I think when you think about that kind of growth right now, Harrison Street has amassed a portfolio of over 50 billion, and you're sourcing capital from all around the world. What have been the main drivers in that growth, and how has your investment thesis adapted throughout that time, nearly 20 years?
The original thesis was really to be focused on alternative real assets. That's what it was from the beginning. And back then this was really between Chris Galvin and another one of the founders, Christopher Merrill. They were looking at asset classes that they felt would be able to sustain any type of economic shift. Again, time frame, they're talking about this 2005, so just before the GFC.
Right.
So we don't know this is coming at this point. And so they look at the asset classes of senior housing, student housing, medical office, and self-storage, because they're thinking no matter what happens in the economy, people are still going to age. People are still going to be sending their kids to school.
Right.
People are still going to get sick, and people are still going to have too much stuff. So all of those things just seem to make sense. And lo and behold, we made it through a couple of black swan events very, very well.
Yeah.
GFC and the COVID crisis. And then since that time, in terms of the growth, because these were asset classes that were so strong, obviously we've continued to grow there, but now we've also folded in other ones. So we also invest in life science, and we invest in data centers, and we've kind of broadened what we're doing around healthcare.
Yeah.
We do build to rent. So on the real estate side, there's a lot there. And then we also do invest on the infrastructure side as well. Things like public-private partnerships and solar farms, wind farms, hydro, those types of things we do as well. So we've broadened it, but we have stayed true to our thesis that we really are focused on the alternative real assets.
Yeah, that's great. And how has the team grown in that time?
Oh,
as
the
well?
team's grown a lot. So it was way back when it had formed back in September of 2005, it was 5 individuals. And I think we're probably closing in about 300 people, and we're in a number of different office locations. So Chicago is our headquarters, but we have offices in London and in DC and in Tokyo and in Seoul and in San Francisco, just to name a few of the major places where we're at.
Yes, that's fantastic. And I think it's a testament to the strength and the investment thesis as well. And I think 20 plus years, 50 billion in assets under management. I think obviously there's a lot of growing pains that comes with that too. But to see that kind of resilience through multiple cycles and multiple black swan events is really fantastic. And I think, when we're thinking about modern times as well, I think one of the biggest themes right now is this idea of technological disruption. And the real estate sector has traditionally been known to be very, very slow at adopting new technology. There have been a number of case studies, the impact of myopic behavior on cycles and often distressed people kind of chasing the demand or the lack of supply. For instance, sustainability in the built environment as an investment strategy can trace a lot of its roots to financial and often fiscal impacts on real estate investments. I think a lot of ways that can be seen as a catalyst, at least historically, for why sponsors or investors have pursued those type of capital intensive projects on their properties. But as technology and the regulatory environment changes, how can operators, small and large, continue to advance ESG initiatives in such a rapidly changing environment while maintaining a long-term vision for the future of their investments?
So I will clarify that Harrison Street as a company doesn't operate any properties, but we work with an entire network of operators, probably somewhere between 100, maybe 120 any given day. The one thing that I think Harrison Street can do, which is perhaps a little unique, is we're able to bring these operators together, whether it's by asset class. So, for example, all of our senior housing operators, say there's 30 or 40 of them, they get together and we will hold a conference where we focus on sharing case studies, sharing new technologies, because as you said, historically, it is slow in the real estate industry. And I will say, coming from technology and coming to real estate, I felt like some of the things when I first started in the real estate side, I'm like, oh my gosh, you're 10 years behind. What's going on here? But as you dive into these different asset classes, there's wonderful technologies just in terms of how you can take better care of your residents and seniors. So it's really bringing these operators together to have them share with one another what are the new technologies. And I will tell you, Dean, it's so much more powerful when they're seeing what I don't want to say a competitor, because they do feel that they're all in this together. They will say that in the senior living industry, they will say it's the home that's the competition. They collectively need to come up with a better alternative than the home. Yeah. So they'll share different technologies. During COVID, when we had issues about just not having enough caregivers, they'll talk about what are you doing to attract and retain. And it's wonderful that they can learn and from one another and just share stories with one another. So I think the impetus is again, when it comes to ESG, my whole mantra has always been it's about collaboration, not competition. Yeah. So one of the things, like I said, we do is we bring these people together, whether it's by asset class. We also do a standalone ESG operating partner conference that we do once a year, but we do one in the US and we do one for North America and one in London for Europe. And the same thing there. Now, this is asset class agnostic. So you might have someone in student housing talking about a biodiversity project that they're doing that someone in the medical office may say, oh, wow, that's great. Yeah. Or someone in life science talking about how they're addressing embodied carbon and it's giving ideas to somebody in senior. So those types of things are really, really powerful. So I think one of the ways they can, because everything is so fluid, back to your question, is to really learn from one another and educate one another and to work on this together. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think the natural osmosis in a lot of those contexts, there's so much knowledge that can be transferred based on location. And I think in a lot of ways, I'd imagine you're developing a lot of research based on some of these conversations as well that you can distribute to your networks, which is fantastic. Absolutely. And I'll just really quickly on one of the things, research. So we have a partnership with Mayo Clinic, and they have a group there called the Well Living Lab. It's a collaboration between Delos and Mayo Clinic. And one of the things that we did with them is we wanted to see how lighting inside our senior living communities impacts the occupant's health. And so the researchers from the lab went through a lot of papers and read up about circadian lighting. And a lot of the research said, after you hit a certain point with circadian lighting is mimicking nature, mimicking how the sun would be on a regular day. The researchers basically said, once you got to a certain point, there's no more, you can't squeeze any more out of that juice, out of that lemon, so to speak, or orange. And they wanted to test that theory that research, because they said, as people age, their eyesight deteriorates in many cases. So what they did is they significantly upped the intensity on a lot of the circadian lighting. And the net of this 16-week, I believe it was 16-week study in our communities, where they were able to increase people's sleep significantly and their deep sleep. They were able to improve their cognitive capabilities and improve their overall wellness. Now, how does that translate back to us as an operator? Well, if people are feeling better and sleeping better and all of that, ideally they're going to live longer, and so it's just, it kind of, and they maybe don't need as much care and all of these other things. So it really is, again, a wonderful outcome by working with these different researchers.
So that's almost an example of, a hospital system, but almost a private institution promoting research and, experimenting with their own facilities, sharing that knowledge with your network, accelerating that process of bringing health back to the system. I think that's a tremendous value proposition for any organization. We
think so too. And then what we do is we share these findings with all of our other operators, and we give them kind of a guidebook as to, this is how all of you that actually have circadian lighting already in your system, this is how you might want to change the programming on it, because we found these benefits from it.
That's fantastic. So stepping back a little bit, I guess we want to talk a little bit about some of the current trends. I know we talked about the theme of technological disruption, but what are the things that specifically excite you the most, be it in the ESG space and the energy space, but anything as it pertains to the built environment? Could be asset agnostic, could be specific to any one particular asset that you're working on or have more of a closer lens on at the moment.
Well, I think it has to be a combination of technology and the human beings inside there. You can't just throw technology in and feel like it's going to make a difference. In fact, we did have a situation where one of our buildings, they put in some of these sensors that controlled the actual heating and cooling system. And the people living in there figured out how to override it. So the whole intent of trying to control it didn't happen. It didn't work. However, there was a different situation where in Europe, we've put in over 11,000 sensors that track a number of different things, but let's just talk about the heating in this particular case. When the Ukraine-Russia war came out, energy prices skyrocketed. And we were paying the bills on all of that. And we were like, it's fine. We know we need to pay, but we believe there's probably some cases where some people are abusing the system, but we didn't know who. So that's one of the reasons why we put these sensors in. And we did find in one case, there was one particular unit that the meter was just spinning and spinning. It was because the students there were running a dry cleaning business out of their dorm. So, you have to give it to them for being entrepreneurial, but, that really wasn't the intent of this. But the bottom line is we were able to educate the residents on how they were using the energy, what they were doing, and gamified the system and got them really involved. And we've now created millions of dollars of value for these properties because we've got the residents involved. So whether they're the ones paying for it or we're the ones paying for it, it's just the smart thing to do. So I don't think you should rely on technology independent of the people that is being impacted. It's part of the change management too. If you just throw in technology and you don't include them, you're going to have what I said in the first example. There's going to be this rejection of it. But if you're able to put them together in a nice program and they see the benefits, all of that, it works beautifully.
Yeah, I think I remembered reading something this week about how installing, building management systems and automated systems to regulate temperature control, among all things, it only works if people let it work, or if you train people to use them. Some of these brand new trophy buildings, people have overridden the same tools and are not operating them to the full capacity or fully efficiently. So I think leveraging technology as a tool is an important lesson, and I think something that is going to be a major theme in the next kind of phase of the cycle. So one thing I wanted to ask you as well is about infrastructure. So Harrison Street established its infrastructure business in 2018, focusing on addressing issues related to deferred maintenance, sustainability, decarbonization in some of these institutions, municipalities, universities, schools, hospitals. Chris Merrill, you mentioned, the current chairman and CEO of Harrison Street, cited the continued adoption of public-private partnerships as one of the 6 themes for alternative real assets investing in 24. What are some of the emerging needs for public institutions at this point in the cycle, and what are you all doing to contribute?
Well, a lot of them do have aging infrastructure, there's no question. And they also have decarbonization or net zero goals. So it's how can we work together to help them to get to that point? So it's putting in new technology, putting in new infrastructure to help them address those goals. That's one of the big goals that they have there. And just the nature of campuses is different. I mean, there might be things where you need upgraded dorms, you need maybe innovation centers, you may need other community services or gathering places that maybe didn't exist or wasn't thought of a decade or two ago. So I think it's really creating a space that where students can thrive. We're always concerned about things like mental health, just kind of in general. So making sure that, students are in a place where they feel very included and those types of issues can't alleviate all of them, but somehow create a space that's far more welcoming. But it's looking at everything comprehensively. So I think a lot of things that we can provide is we can provide an upgrade of all of the infrastructure along with building dorms or student housing or building innovation centers or community centers. We can do that all in one fell swoop. And I think that's what a lot of these universities or municipalities are looking for, a much more comprehensive solution.
That's great. And are you finding any common themes among some of these institutions? Do you think there's any specific need with any certain asset classes or any, for example, student housing, maybe the stock of student housing in general, agnostically across all geographies has been aging, and you find that to be a common theme? Are there any major ones that at this point in the cycle might be, reflecting more prominently?
Well, obviously, certainly depends on the age of the university, right? In terms of where they are, the size of the university, all of that. So everybody's at a different phase. So we would be more apt to serve those that are perhaps more progressive with, like I said, their carbon emissions goals, and really in a position where their infrastructure is aging and they really do need help in terms of reducing their emissions and improving their efficiencies.
Fantastic. So some of these ESG narratives that we're talking about in some of our classes these days is involving the goals of 100% electrification for some of these commercial assets, in the sense tying long-term sustainability goals to green initiatives with the electricity grid. With some of these emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, automation becoming more and more commercially adopted, data center development reaching new heights. I read yesterday that data center leases alone in 2023 had an impact equivalent to adding one full New York City to the grid. How might these goals impact the grid capacity at this stage?
Yeah, so everything you've talked about, the ramp up of data centers, moving buildings to be all electric, that's all going to pull on the grid. And that's kind of the concern. I mean, right now you have some places where, depending on where you're going to build a data center, you may have to wait a long time. We're talking about years even to get power. So there are those types of issues. But how do we address this? And this is actually a question we get from our investors too, from the ESG side, because they're very interested in investing in data centers, but they want to know what's the ESG strategy associated with it. Very recently, within the last week or so, you've probably heard the Microsofts and the Googles and the Amazons of the world coming out and talking about the large investments. We're talking, 500, was it million, 500 million, I think. I should get my numbers right. I'll have to check that later. That they're investing in these small modular reactors. They're going nuclear on this. Microsoft is ramping up again 3 Mile Island. So these types of things are happening. It really has to come from the hyperscalers. They're the ones that are going to have to address this. And these are the guys, the AWSs, the Microsofts, the Googles of the world that have these net zero goals. So it makes sense for them to move it. And if we get to a point where there's enough money behind this, then building these small modular reactors, it'll be scalable. So that will probably, my guess is that nuclear will probably be the way to go. Now, whether that's a short-term solution and then we go to something beyond that, whether it's fusion or something like that later, yet to be seen, but that's probably going to be the short-term solution. My comment on this too is, especially as it relates to data centers, don't focus just on the energy. Water, which is used in many of these data centers to cool the servers, water is a scarce resource as well, especially if you're in someplace, I don't know, Arizona or in some of these deserts. You have to think about that. So we need to be thinking about the water element in here, or if there's different ways to cool these. I'm not saying you build underground, but what do you do to think differently about how to cool it? The other thing is light pollution, noise pollution, just the aesthetics of the building, and how are you engaging with communities? As some of these data centers get closer and closer to residential areas, there have been cases over in Europe for some of these bigger players where the projects were basically killed because the community had said, we don't want this in our backyard. So how do you educate people that this is a good thing and you do want it in your backyard? And the fact that we have some of these data centers is actually aggregating so much of the things that are happening in the broader ecosystem. So you're actually reducing your carbon emissions by having these rather than increasing it.
Right.
So those are the types of things around the education. But I think way back when the internet first came about, I think the word on the street was, oh my gosh, this is going to pull all the power. And that didn't happen. So I don't anticipate it's going to happen in this case either. Technology will be working in lockstep, but that's kind of how I would address that.
That's really interesting. So there's quite a lot of sentiment around private investment in partnerships to kind of increase that capacity if that does become an issue as well. Yeah, that's great. So I think the next thing we wanted to discuss is the G component of ESG. So governance and how certain regulatory agencies leverage policy to impact sustainability goals. I think we've all seen both the carrot and this idea of the carrot and the stick. I think there's a lot of incentives right now for green investment, but there's also a lot of penalties that are coming to fruition through the DOE and other regulatory agencies. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on regulatory's kind of ethical responsibility in providing those carrots and sticks to investors, and some good policies, some bad policies, and where you think the regulatory side might go in the future.
Sure. So you're exactly right. There is a mix of carrots and sticks. So we have here in the States, we have the whole Inflation Reduction Act, which is very much a carrot and rewarding people for doing various ESG related activities. In Europe, in certain pockets, it's very much more of a stick. And if your building isn't running at a particular efficiency, you may not even be able to rent those buildings in the near future. So there is a mix of both. And you probably do need a mix of both because I think people react differently to those types of things. Us personally, we don't want to be waiting for that stick. We want to be well ahead of that. And so what we really look at is what do our key stakeholders, what makes sense for them, whether that's our investors, whether that's the occupants of our building, whomever the key stakeholder is. In terms of what's good and bad, I mean, some of this regulation came out. Really, it was because people weren't playing right. I mean, the whole concept of greenwashing, and you have SFDR, which is the Sustainable Disclosure Financial Regulation, which comes out of Europe. And that was really to address greenwashing. And it was saying you need to really, if you're going to say that you're doing things as it pertains to ESG, you need to be able to demonstrate that you are, and you need to make these various commitments. So we have a number of our funds are in alignment with those types of regulations. Even though it's a European thing, it just makes sense to follow this. And the SEC is following some of those similar types of requirements or layout that they are there. So it's almost, I see it as not a positive thing that the fact that we even had to get to that. And it's because you had a few back actors or a few bad apples, and then we got to that. So I think, in terms of what I'm trying to look at is I don't want to have any type of regulations or government activity that really becomes so bureaucratic that people just throw their hands up and say, we're not going to do this anymore because we have to fill out so many disclosures. We have to jump through so many hoops that it's just not worth it. I don't ever want to get to that point. So we're trying to stay ahead of all of this. And I don't think anything, like even here in Boston, there's various building regulations that we have to meet in terms of various efficiencies. So I think that's all good. I think where we might run into problems in some of these cases is, how do you hold people accountable? So even the New York Local Law 97, when a lot of these things came out, how are you holding people accountable? California has some new regulations they're in the process of passing, but now there's some lawsuits coming up against that because certain companies are saying, well, we can't comply with this for various reasons. And in some cases, they may have a very legitimate reason. So it's not quite that black and white. So I think there's definitely a place for all these regulations. And I think the intent is to move everybody to a better place. And I do think you need that combination, and we'll continue to see how these continue to progress. But
are there any specific case studies or kind of jurisdictions, municipalities around the country that are really doing a great job, or in a sense might be models for what could be better applied at a federal level, or perhaps something that's going on in Europe or in another country that might benefit our local our local ESG goals?
I mean, certainly like when New York Local Law 97 came out, that was really looking at the transition risk and how we're adapting to that. At that point in time, it was only publicized for New York. So I actually ran our entire portfolio through that regulation just to see how we would stack up. And not that all of our portfolio is in New York City, but it was a good proxy to use. And I think those types of things will really help, and they can serve as models. Like I said, in those cases, I think the big thing is how are you going to hold people accountable, and how are you going to, if you're going to be giving some sort of a carbon fine or a carbon tax, how's it actually being captured, and where does that money go, and what are you doing with it? So is it going to make the building more efficient, or is it going, who knows? So, those types of things. So the devil's still in the details on some of those, but I think we have some early, and like I said, in Boston, in California, in Colorado, there are pockets where they're really running forward with, and of course over in Europe, with some of these regulations that I think we're going to see how it plays out, and if it does make sense for something to be more of a federal law. The issue I think you have is we have such a big country, and what happens in Maine could be so different than what happens in Arizona. Like Arizona could be much more on water, and Maine not so much. So it probably does have to be localized to a great extent.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I think I totally agree with you. I think a lot of the themes come around the compliance space, and I think the devil is in the details. We saw some cases with carbon credits and how that can be manipulated.
Absolutely, that's a great example.
So one of the critical arguments against ESG initiatives and real assets is the financial burden and the capital-intensive nature of certain projects. This is especially true when considering older vintage assets, retrofits, and current trends like adaptive reuse. However, much of the data that we are seeing today indicates a high correlation between occupancy goals, operating revenues, decreased operating expenses with greener assets. Could you describe some of the work that your team is doing to quantify the return on investment of the ESG initiatives?
Absolutely. And we get this question quite often from investors where they'll actually ask, when you're faced between doing an ESG initiative or making financial returns, which one do you choose? And I'm always like, oh my goodness, it's not one or the other. I mean, for us, the sole reason we're doing this is because we believe it's going to create a more attractive, better performing product. But why is that question even asked? I had to think to myself, why is this even a question? If we put in, let's say it's a residential property and we put in a pool or we put in a gym, we don't sit there and go like, well, I don't know if I'm going to put the pool in because I'm going to sell it before I would get my return. But we do on the ESG activities. And why I think we do this is way back when a lot of these efforts started, what would happen is you would have someone come in and they would do an efficiency audit, utility efficiency audit. So they'd look at your water, your electricity, all those types of things, and they would create a report. And then from that report, you'd have vendors come in. And let's say the report said you can upgrade your lighting. And the vendor would say, oh, I can upgrade your lighting to LEDs, 2 to 3 year payback. Maybe it said put on-site solar. A different vendor would say, well, we can do that. It's like a 10-year payback. And then the person who's owning the building, maybe they're only owning it for 5 years. And they'll be like, oh, well, yeah, I'll do the LEDs. 2, 3 year payback? Absolutely. But I'm not going to do the solar because I'll sell it well before then. And no one was thinking about, well, what's the value that's actually been created? They were just looking at this payback. And I will tell you now, any ESG conference you go to, you will hear that term, simple payback, simple payback, simple payback, over and over. So I'm kind of trying to single-handedly change the mindset and have people look at value creation. So what we've done is we've been doing utility efficiency upgrades since 2014. We've done around 378 projects. Most of those are retrofits, but about 50, 60 of those are new developments, meaning we're building to a higher standard than code, more efficient than code. We've put in about $53 million into all of those, but its return in terms of, or what it's created in value is over $225 million.
Wow.
And how you get that number is you look at what's the annual savings because you have a more efficient property now than you had previously. And then you divide that by a stabilized cap rate. And so, people could argue, well, cap rate's really this and not this. It's still math. And play around with it as much as you want. You're still going to get a really big return. And that for us is how we're able to quantify that on the E side. People understand the E. People understand if I put in lights, my electricity bill is going to go down if I have LEDs over incandescent. What we're also working on now is the S side. And how do you quantify the S? So we're in the process of, we have what we refer to as a social scorecard that is tracking how a building performs against a benchmark in terms of social. And we're now we're in the process of tying that into how does that correlate, if at all, to rent prices, to occupancy, to tenure, to overall building value, all those types of things. And then we'll be able to present that as well.
That's great. And have you found in your research that this benchmarking is really municipality based? Does each jurisdiction kind of have their own way of benchmarking those S goals?
So for the S, it's not so much by municipality, but by asset class. So I would say 70 to 80% of the scorecard is going to be the same, depending on, it doesn't matter if you're a multifamily, if you're an office, if you're, whatever asset class you are. But then it's tweaked slightly for whatever that particular asset class is, because what happens in a senior living community obviously is very different than what happens in a traditional office. And we look at it from three different pillars. We look at it from the pillar of the building occupant, whether that is staff or if it's a residential, the resident. We look at it from the building management perspective. And the last social pillar we look at is the community as a whole.
That's great. So I would imagine that we're also just scratching the surface of how the built environment can benefit from renewable energy. And going back to your background in studying fusion technology and some of these more emerging technologies that juxtaposed to real estate are much more innovative and advanced. I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of these intriguing trends or applications of renewable technologies that we may see in greater abundance in the near future. And I know you teased fusion technology before, and it's still extremely early and speculative, but would love to hear about those advancements.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier in the question about the data center, certainly these small modular reactors on the nuclear side are going to be, I think that'll probably be very big. Fusion, I think we're starting to see some advancements there. I worked in it, a number of years ago, and back then it was always like, oh, in 20 years it'll be here. In 20 years it's always 20 years it's going to be here. But Lawrence Livermore Labs is now making some advancements there. You still have a number of these national laboratories that are making advancements. And for any of the listeners on fusion is really how the sun makes energy. So if you're able to replicate how the sun makes energy, you will have this perpetual source of energy. And that's why it's so incredibly exciting and powerful. And again, we haven't completely cracked that nut, but that's where we're going. And of course, there are other things that I would say that's probably like the most exciting that I would say. But certainly we're seeing other things that aren't necessarily new technology, but maybe increasing in terms of their prevalence, like heat pumps. Just some of these different ways of looking at how you're heating and cooling. And I think we're seeing more of that as we start to transition more away from coal. Some of these other types of technologies will become more commonplace than they are today.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think everyone's, it's interesting that you say 20 years. It's
always 20 years.
That people are pushing back on. Yeah, I do think when we reflect on the potential application in the built environment, it's a really exciting project and endeavor, even if it is 20 or 40 years down the line. So we're kind of wrapping up on some of these questions, Jill, but I wanted to take some time to really ask you, what you're working on right now and what you're most excited about in these next, 6 to 12 months, and given where we are in the current cycle.
Sure. So one of the big things that we're working on is we're actually working with MIT, and we're talking right here in the offices, just because we just finished a great workshop, and we are looking at everything we were just talking about in terms of how do you quantify the financial impact from some of these ESG activities. So we've spent the last couple hours talking about various regression analysis and machine learning to really try to figure this out. We want to make sure that what we do as it pertains to ESG truly does have financial value. And if there's something that we find out really isn't making sense for our stakeholders, we'll stop doing that. But we want to be able to quantify that. So that's a really big project that we're working on. Social project that I mentioned before, we're working with Maastricht University on that. So that's been very exciting. I mentioned Mayo Clinic already that we're working with. So we're not going to win, and I don't even know what win means, but we're not going to succeed by ourselves. So we really need to have these partnerships and work collaboratively to move it to the next level. Some other things that are coming up Biodiversity is a big piece. So we have a research paper that we're writing on biodiversity and how does that impact everything we do. When you build a building or you're operating a building, you need to make sure you're cognizant of the flora, the fauna, the wildlife, everything around that. And I could deliver for you a building that is net zero. It's resilient to everything that Mother Nature has thrown at it. But if I haven't thought about the human and the wildlife element to that, it's just an empty shell. So that's all really important too. I would say for us, the biggest challenge is there's so many things we could be doing that you don't want to be a mile wide and an inch thick. You really want to make sure you're focusing on the vital few, not the trivial many. So I think we have a lot of great things on our plate right now, and we'll continue to advance everything we're doing thus far.
That's awesome. Well, Jill Brosig, everyone, thank you all for joining. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much.
Joining us on our podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Excellent. That was fun. Thanks.
Thanks to our listeners for tuning into another edition of Meet the Visionaries podcast. And please remember to stay tuned for future episodes by subscribing to our podcast or follow us on social media by visiting cre.mit.edu to learn more. Until next time, take care, listeners.